The year was 1888. In the deep, wrinkled heart of the Ozark Mountains, there was a town called Providence. It was less a town and more a clearing, a small collection of cabins and a single church spire carved from the dense, ancient wilderness. Life there was governed by two things: the turn of the seasons and the Word of God. The people of Providence were simple and hard. They worked the unforgiving soil. They raised their children in fear of the Lord, and they kept to the old ways. Their world was small, defined by the stony hills that rose on all sides, trapping the morning fog in the hollows until the sun was high and hot in the sky. It was a place of deep roots and quiet faith, where the greatest disturbance was a dry spell or a long winter. The families knew each other by blood and by marriage, their histories intertwined like the wild vines that choked the oak trees. They gathered on Sundays in the stark white chapel of St. James Parish, their voices rising in hymns that echoed off the silent, watchful mountains. They knew who was sick, who was thriving, and who had strayed from the path. They knew every soul within their small orbit, except for one family. On the highest, most isolated ridge, a place the townsfolk called Harrow's Peak, stood a single, dark cabin. It was there that the Harrow family lived, and it was from there that the wrongness began to bleed into the valley. For years, the Harrows were only a rumor, a name spoken in low tones. No one in Providence had ever seen them up close. They never came to the market for salt or seed. They never attended the Sunday service to ask for grace. They were a phantom limb of the community, a presence felt only by its profound and deliberate absence. Then, the small disturbances began, like the first few drops of rain before a storm. It started with Jedediah Croft, a farmer whose land bordered the dense woods that climbed toward the ridge. Jedediah was a man who prided himself on his prize-winning sow, a creature of immense size and placid temperament. He had raised it from a piglet, and its yearly litter was a significant part of his family's meager income. He kept the sow in a pen he had built himself, with thick oak posts and a heavy iron latch. One morning in late spring, he went to feed her and found the pen empty. The heavy wooden gate was still barred from the outside. The packed dirt floor of the pen was undisturbed. There were no tracks, no sign of digging, no splintered wood where a predator might have forced its way in. There was only an impossible emptiness, a silence where there should have been the familiar, contented grunts of the animal. Jedediah Croft searched the perimeter for hours, his confusion slowly souring into a cold, creeping dread. The woods at the edge of his property were unnaturally still. The birds did not sing. He said later, to the men gathered at the general store, that it felt as if the forest itself was holding its breath. He said the sow was simply gone, as if it had dissolved into the morning mist. This was the uncanny aberration, a theft without a thief, a disappearance without a trace. It was the first tear in the fabric of their predictable world. Soon, the whispers in Providence began to find a name. The name was Harrow. The quiet farmers and their wives, people who had lived their whole lives by what they could see and touch, began to look toward the dark silhouette of the cabin on the ridge. They began to connect the strangeness to the silent, unseen family who lived there. The story of Jedediah's sow was followed by others. A milk cow vanished from a locked barn 2 miles south. An entire coop of chickens disappeared overnight, the door still latched, the straw on the floor as clean as if it had been swept. The losses were small, but the pattern was deeply unsettling. There was never any evidence of violence. No blood, no tufts of fur, no splintered wood. The animals were simply there one night and gone the next. The men of the town formed small patrols, walking the edges of their farms with rifles in their hands, but they found nothing. They saw no tracks belonging to bear or wolf. They saw only their own footprints in the soft earth and the deep, dark woods that led up to Harrow's Peak. The disappearances were a quiet plague, an act of unseen malevolence that defied all reason. The people of Providence began to understand that they were living beside something they did not know. They began to understand that the secluded family on the ridge was not just reclusive, it was sinister. If the forgotten voices of history call to you, and this is your first time here, consider subscribing to join our circle of archivists and keep the past within reach. The Harrow family had lived on that ridge for as long as anyone could remember, yet no one truly remembered them arriving. They were simply a fact of the landscape, like the oldest trees or the sharpest stones. The cabin was a dark wound in the side of the mountain, a place from which no smoke was ever seen to rise, and from which no sound was ever heard to fall. It was said that a man named Silas Harrow lived there, with his wife, Elspeth, and their 2 children, a boy and a girl, but these were just names, hollow sounds without faces to attach to them. No one in the valley had seen the Harrow children. No one could say if they were young or old, fair or dark. They were ghosts, spoken of by other children in hushed, frightened tones. The children of Providence, who played in the creeks and fields until dusk, were the first to see the lights. They would gather in small, brave circles as the sun bled out behind the mountains, and they would watch Harrow's Peak. On certain nights, when the air was cold and clear, strange fires would appear on the ridge. They were not the warm, comforting orange of a hearth fire. They were cold, spectral lights. Sometimes a sickly green, sometimes a deep and piercing blue. The lights would dance and weave between the trees, moving with an unnatural speed and purpose. The 10-year-old Elias Vance, a boy known for his steady nerve, was the first to speak of it to an adult. He told his father he had seen the lights. He said they did not crackle or spark like a proper fire. He said they made no sound at all. His father, a practical man, dismissed it as swamp gas or a trick of the evening light. But then a hunter, a man named Thomas Fell, who spent more time in the woods than in his own home, saw them too. He had been tracking a deer late one evening when he saw the blue fire flicker to life high on the ridge. He was a man who knew the forest and its secrets, and he knew that what he was seeing was not natural. He spoke of it at the general store, his voice low and serious, and the dismissal of the parents turned to a quiet, shared unease. The fires on the ridge became another piece of the unsettling puzzle, another sign that the family in the dark cabin was not bound by the same rules as the people in the valley below. The life of Providence revolved around its community. The Sunday service at St. James Parish was the anchor of their week. It was where they came together to confess their sins, to celebrate their unions, and to mourn their dead. Father Alistair Finch, a young, scholarly priest sent from a city far to the east, stood at the pulpit each week and looked out at the faces of his flock. He saw the farmers with their sun-beaten skin and calloused hands. He saw the mothers holding their infants, their faces etched with a mixture of weariness and hope. He saw every member of his congregation, but he never saw the Harrows. Their absence was a constant, nagging question in his mind. He believed that no soul was beyond the reach of God, but the family on the ridge seemed to exist in a place where the church bell could not ring. He once spoke to the town sheriff, a broad-shouldered man named Elias Croft, about his concern. He asked if the family should be visited, if they were in need of spiritual guidance or material aid. The sheriff, a man who had lived in the shadow of those mountains his entire life, simply shook his head. He said the Harrows had always been there, and they had always been alone. He said it was best to leave them be. But now, with the stories of vanishing livestock and strange lights, leaving them be no longer felt like an act of respect. It felt like an act of cowardice. The fear was a quiet contagion, spreading through the town not in loud accusations, but in subtle changes of habit. Doors that were once left unlocked at night were now bolted shut. Children who once roamed freely until the last light of day were now called home at the first sign of dusk. Mothers would stand on their porches, their eyes scanning the dark line of trees at the edge of their property, a silent prayer on their lips. The men grew more watchful, their conversations more subdued. They spoke of the weather, of the crops, but beneath the surface, the unspoken topic was always the family on the hill. The Harrows' refusal to participate in the life of the town was no longer seen as eccentricity. It was seen as a threat. Their self-sufficiency was a profound insult to the community's way of life, which was built on interdependence and shared struggle. How did they survive without buying flour or salt? How did they mend their clothes without buying thread? How did they live, utterly and completely apart, in a world where survival depended on one's neighbors? The questions hung in the air, unanswered and unanswerable, feeding the growing dread. The Harrows were not just outside the community, they were against it. The unease in Providence festered through the summer months. The heat was oppressive, the air thick and still. The strange occurrences continued, small pinpricks in the daily rhythm of life. A farmer would find a tool missing from his shed, only to find it days later, placed neatly in the center of an open field, impossibly far from where it should have been. A woman would hang her laundry out to dry, and a single child's shirt would vanish from the line, with no wind to explain its disappearance. Each incident, taken alone, was a minor curiosity. But together, they formed a disturbing narrative, a story of a quiet, creeping invasion. The target of this narrative was always the same. Every hushed conversation, every fearful glance, ended up pointing toward the dark cabin on Harrow's Peak. The family became a vessel for all the town's anxieties, a focal point for the fear of the unknown that lurked just beyond their cleared fields. The children's whispers became darker. They no longer spoke only of the strange lights. They began to tell stories of seeing figures moving at the edge of the woods, tall and thin shapes that seemed to glide rather than walk. They said the figures watched them play, their faces obscured by the deep shadows of the trees. The adults, now primed by their own fears, did not dismiss these stories so easily. They began to see things themselves, a flicker of movement in their peripheral vision as they worked the fields, a sense of being watched as they walked the lonely paths between cabins. The forest that had always been a source of sustenance and solitude now felt menacing, its familiar shadows hiding a new and nameless threat. The psychological toll on the town was immense. The bonds of community, once their greatest strength, began to fray under the strain of constant, low-level fear. Neighbors began to eye each other with suspicion. A misplaced word could be interpreted as a sign of allegiance with the darkness on the ridge. The comfortable certainty of their world was eroding, replaced by a pervasive sense of vulnerability. The breaking point came in the early days of autumn, when the leaves on the trees were just beginning to turn. Martha Vance, the wife of a farmer and the mother of the 10-year-old Elias, went to her well one morning to draw water. She was a woman known for her quiet strength and her unwavering faith, a humanizing anchor in her small family. Her greatest joy was the small patch of marigolds she tended beside her cabin, a splash of vibrant color against the drab landscape. That morning, as she lowered the bucket into the cool darkness of the well, she saw something caught on the rope. It was a doll, a small, crudely made thing of stitched sackcloth and button eyes. But it was not just any doll. It was the one that had belonged to her daughter Sarah, who had died of fever 2 winters before. Martha had buried the doll with her child in the small cemetery behind the church. There was no earthly way it could be here, dangling from the well rope, its button eyes staring up at her with a blank, accusatory gaze. The sight broke something inside her. Her scream was a raw, ragged thing that tore through the morning calm, a sound of pure, undiluted terror. Her husband and son came running, and soon other neighbors arrived. They saw the doll, and they saw the look on Martha's face, and they knew that a line had been crossed. This was not a missing pig or a strange light. This was a violation, a desecration of memory, an act of profound and personal cruelty. The discovery of the doll galvanized the town. The quiet, creeping fear hardened overnight into a cold, focused anger. The whispers ceased, replaced by grim, determined pronouncements. Something had to be done. The men of Providence gathered in front of the church, their faces set and serious. They held their hunting rifles and their farming tools, their hands accustomed to the weight of wood and steel. They were no longer just concerned neighbors. They were protectors of their homes, their families, and their way of life. Sheriff Elias Croft stood before them, his face a mask of solemn duty. Beside him stood Father Alistair Finch, his youthful features looking old and weary in the morning light. They had resisted this course of action, hoping for a peaceful, rational explanation. But reason had fled from the valley. There was only the fear and the dark cabin on the ridge. The sheriff said that they would go up the mountain. He said they would get answers. The men nodded in silent agreement. It was time to confront the Harrows. It was time to bring the darkness into the light. As they prepared to make the long climb up the winding, overgrown path to Harrow's Peak, a cold wind swept down from the mountain, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and decay. It was a wind that promised an early winter and something more. It was the wind of change, and it carried a warning that what they were about to find would be far worse than anything they had ever imagined. The unease that had plagued them for months was about to end. The terror was about to begin. The climb to Harrow's Peak was a silent, grim procession. There were 12 of them in total. Sheriff Elias Croft led the way, his face carved from the same hard stone as the mountain itself. His rifle was held loosely in one hand, but his knuckles were white. He was a man of the law, a believer in evidence and reason. But the path he walked now led away from such certainties. Behind him walked Father Alistair Finch. The young priest did not carry a weapon. Instead, his hands, pale and slender, and better suited to the delicate pages of a book, were wrapped around a heavy oaken cross that hung from his neck. His lips moved silently, forming prayers that were swallowed by the oppressive quiet of the woods. The other 10 men were farmers and tradesmen, their expressions a mixture of anger and a deep, primal fear. They were not soldiers. They were fathers and husbands, and they were walking into a place that their instincts told them to shun. The forest grew thicker and darker as they ascended. The familiar sounds of the Ozark woods, the chatter of squirrels and the call of birds, fell away. A profound silence descended, broken only by the snap of twigs under their boots and their own ragged breathing. The trees seemed to lean in, their ancient branches like skeletal arms blocking out the sun. The air grew cold, carrying a damp, earthy smell that was more like a cellar than a forest. It was the smell of a place that the sun had not touched for a very long time. They came to the clearing at the top of the ridge just after midday. The sight that met them was unnerving in its stillness. The Harrow cabin stood in the center of a wide, circular patch of bare earth. There was no grass, no weeds, not a single living plant within 50 feet of the structure. The dirt was packed hard and smooth, as if it had been swept clean every day for 100 years. The cabin itself was a dark, windowless box of hewn logs, the wood weathered to a deep, almost black color. It looked ancient, yet impossibly preserved. There was no moss on the roof, no rot in the logs, no sign of the relentless decay that was the law of these mountains. It was as if time itself was afraid to touch this place. The men fanned out, their rifles raised, their eyes scanning the silent tree line that bordered the clearing. There was no movement. There was no sound. No smoke rose from the stone chimney. No animal tracks marked the bare earth. The property felt less abandoned and more paused, like a single, held breath. Sheriff Croft approached the cabin's single door, his boots making no sound on the hard-packed ground. He raised his hand to knock, then hesitated. There was a profound sense of wrongness here, a violation of natural law that he could feel in his bones. He had dealt with violence, with theft, with the desperate acts of desperate men. But this was different. This was a place that felt outside of God's grace. He pushed the door. It swung inward without a sound, opening onto a single, dark room. The air that rolled out of the cabin was thick and foul. It was a smell of rot, but with a sweet, cloying undertone that turned the stomach. The men recoiled, covering their mouths and noses with their hands. Inside, the cabin was dark, the only light coming from the open doorway. As their eyes adjusted, they saw a scene of bizarre and terrible domesticity. In the center of the room was a rough wooden table, set for 4 people. 4 wooden plates were laid out, 4 tin cups, 4 sets of simple cutlery. In the center of the table sat a large black iron pot, its contents a teeming, gray mass of mold and decay. Flies, thick and buzzing, rose in a black cloud as the light hit the pot. It had been a stew once, full of meat and vegetables. Now, it was a monument to putrefaction, but the horror was in the contrast. The rest of the cabin was pristine. The wooden floor was swept clean. A single bed in the corner was made with perfect, crisp corners. A small stack of books on a shelf was aligned with obsessive precision. There was not a speck of dust, not a single cobweb in the rafters. It was a place of meticulous order, except for the explosion of decay on the table. It was as if the family had been sitting down to their evening meal, and had simply vanished in the middle of a bite, leaving the food to rot while the rest of the world remained frozen around it. Father Finch stepped into the room, his eyes wide with a scholarly horror. He said that this was not a place of men. He said it was a place of deep and profound wrongness, a mockery of a human home. The sheriff directed his men to search the small dwelling. The task was performed in a tense, grim silence. They found so little that it was more disturbing than finding anything at all. A small, built-in wardrobe stood against one wall. When they opened it, they found it completely empty. There were no clothes, no shoes, no spare blankets. It was as if the inhabitants owned nothing but the single set of clothes they wore. They checked under the bed, finding only bare, clean floorboards. They looked in the small pantry, which held a few jars of unlabeled preserved items floating in a murky fluid. But no flour, no salt, no coffee. It was impossible. No family could survive in this wilderness without such basic provisions. Their existence defied all logic, all known means of survival. Then, one of the men, a farmer named Silas Vance, the father of the boy Elias, pointed to the far wall. Against it sat 2 large, heavy chests. They were made of a dark, unfamiliar wood and bound with thick straps of black iron. They were the only pieces of furniture in the room besides the table and the bed. As the men approached them, the sweet, foul smell they had first encountered at the door became overwhelmingly strong. It was emanating from the chests. The locks were heavy and complex, unlike anything the town blacksmith had ever forged. The men tried to force them, using the butts of their rifles and a small crowbar they had brought, but the iron did not yield. The wood did not splinter. The chests were impossibly solid, as if they were forged from a single piece of material. Frustrated and unnerved, one of the men knelt down and put his nose to the seam of the lid. He jerked back immediately, his face pale. He said the smell was of spoiled meat, but also something else. He said it smelled like grave dirt and wilted flowers. The chest sat there, silent and locked. radiating a palpable aura of corruption. They contained the Harrow's secrets, and the men were suddenly overcome with the feeling that they did not want those secrets to be revealed. The desire for answers was being replaced by a much stronger desire to flee. While the men inside struggled with the locked chests, two others searched the perimeter of the cabin. They walked the edge of the strange, barren clearing, their eyes on the ground, looking for any sign, any clue that could explain the family's disappearance. One of them, a young man named Caleb, was the farmhand for the Croft family. He was quiet and observant, with a nervous energy that now served him well. He noticed a small patch of dirt near the back of the cabin that was slightly less compacted than the rest. It was a subtle difference, one that most would have overlooked. He knelt down, his curiosity overriding his fear. He began to dig with his bare hands, the cold, sterile soil feeling strange against his skin. A few inches down, his fingers brushed against something soft and yielding. He pulled it from the earth. It was another doll. Like the one found in the Vance's well, it was made of rough burlap and had black buttons for eyes. But this one was different. Around its neck was tied a small strip of blue calico fabric. Caleb stared at it, his blood running cold. He recognized the fabric. It was from a shirt that had belonged to his own younger sister. The shirt had vanished from their laundry line more than a month ago. He stood up slowly, the dirt-caked doll held in his trembling hand. He called out to the sheriff in a voice that was thin and strained. The discovery sent a fresh wave of horror through the assembled men. This was not random. This was personal. The Harrows had not just been keeping to themselves. They had been watching. They had been collecting pieces of the town, pieces of their lives, and burying them in the dead soil around their home. The dolls were not toys. They were effigies. They were threats. The men now understood that they were not dealing with reclusive neighbors. They were dealing with an enemy that had been moving among them, unseen, for a very long time. Sheriff Elias Croft stood in the center of the dark cabin, the weight of his failure pressing down on him. He had brought his men up the mountain to find a human evil, something he could confront and contain. He had come for an explanation. Instead, he had found a vacuum. He had found a perfectly preserved, yet utterly empty shell of a home. He had found rotting food, impossible chests, and buried dolls that spoke of a patient, intimate malice. There were no bodies. There were no signs of a struggle. There was no evidence of a crime that could be named in any law book. There was only the chilling, absolute certainty that the Harrow family was not gone. They had simply stepped away. The men gathered their nerve and retreated from the cabin, leaving the door to swing shut on the pristine room and its rotting feast. They walked back down the mountain in a state of shock, their earlier anger replaced by a deep and profound dread. The mystery had not been solved. It had been amplified into something monstrous. They had looked into the heart of the enigma, and it was empty. They returned to Providence as the sun was setting, painting the sky in angry shades of orange and purple. The men did not speak of what they had found. They did not need to. The horror was written on their faces. That night, a storm broke over the mountains. It was a storm of biblical fury, with howling winds that tore at the roofs of the cabins, and rain that fell in solid, blinding sheets. The thunder was a constant, deafening roar that shook the very foundations of the earth. The people of Providence huddled in their homes, listening to the tempest, feeling as though the world itself was trying to wash away the stain of what the men had discovered on the peak. They locked their doors and shuttered their windows, but they knew it was useless. The evil they feared was not something that could be kept out by a wooden door. The next morning, as the storm finally subsided, a new and more terrible phase of their ordeal began. Caleb, the young farmhand who had found the second doll, did not report for his morning duties at the Croft farm. A search was organized. They found him an hour later. Or rather, they found what was left of him. At the edge of the woods, on the very path that led up toward Harrow's Peak, sat his work boots. They were placed side by side, perfectly neat, as if he had taken them off before continuing on his journey. Of Caleb himself, there was no other trace. He was the first. He would not be the last. The absence of the Harrow family did not bring peace to Providence. It did the opposite. The empty cabin on the ridge became a source of a new and more potent kind of fear. Before, the threat had a name and a location. Now, it was formless, silent, and everywhere. The storm had washed the world clean, but it had left behind a terror that no rain could cleanse. The discovery of Caleb's boots was the beginning. Sheriff Elias Croft had been the one to find them, standing at the head of the small search party in the cold, gray dawn. The boots were set by the side of the muddy path, the one that led from the Croft farm up toward the haunted peak. They were placed with an impossible tidiness, the toes pointing perfectly forward, the laces still tied. The mud of the previous day's storm was caked on the soles and heels, but the leather uppers were clean, as if they had been wiped with a cloth. It was the neatness that was the most horrifying part. It was not the work of a wild animal. It was not the sign of a man who had stumbled and fallen in the storm. It was a statement, a deliberate, mocking gesture. The men in the search party stood in a circle around the boots, their faces pale in the weak light. They did not need to see a body. They knew, with a certainty that settled like a stone in their guts, that Caleb was gone. They knew he had been taken. The men returned to the valley carrying the empty boots, and the sight of them was more terrible than any corpse could have been. The news spread through the town like a fever, a sickness of the soul. The community of Providence, once bound by shared faith and mutual reliance, began to crumble inward. Fear was a solvent, dissolving the trust that had held them together. The town became a collection of isolated islands of terror. By evening, the sound of heavy wooden bolts sliding into place echoed through the hollow. Doors that had not been locked in a generation were now barred and braced with heavy furniture. Windows were shuttered, plunging the cabins into a premature, stuffy darkness, even while the last of the sun's light still touched the valley floor. Families gathered around their hearths, the firelight casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to mock their fragile sense of safety. They did not speak much. There was nothing left to say. The questions had no answers, and the reassurances were hollow. They simply sat and listened to the sounds of the night, every creak of the wood, every rustle of the wind in the trees, becoming a potential threat. They were prisoners in their own homes, besieged by an enemy they could not see or understand. The men took to sitting up through the night, their rifles across their laps, their eyes fixed on the dark squares of the shuttered windows. They were guarding against a phantom, an intruder who left no tracks and made no sound, who could pluck a man from the world and leave only his empty shoes behind. The women gathered their children close, whispering prayers that were raw and desperate. Sleep, when it came at all, was shallow and plagued by nightmares. Father Alistair Finch tried to hold his flock together. He called for a nightly vigil at the small chapel of St. James Parish. Every evening, as dusk settled like a shroud over the valley, the heavy church bell would toll, a lonely, mournful sound calling the faithful to prayer. The women and children would come, their faces drawn and weary, their shawls pulled tight around them as if to ward off a physical chill. They would huddle together on the hard wooden pews, the space around them lit by the flickering, unsteady light of dozens of tallow candles. The small church, once a place of hopeful hymns, became a house of sorrow. Father Finch stood at the pulpit, his Bible open, but the words of comfort and salvation sounded foreign and distant. He spoke of faith in the face of darkness, of God's mysterious plan, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. He was a man of books and theology, and he was wholly unprepared for an evil that was so tangible, so immediate. He led them in prayer, their voices rising in a weak, trembling chorus, a desperate plea for deliverance sent up into the oppressive silence of the mountains. The vigils offered little comfort. The act of gathering only served to concentrate the fear, to give it a single, beating heart. The people looked at the empty spaces on the pews where their missing neighbors should have been, and they felt their own vulnerability like a physical wound. They would leave the church in small, hurried groups, their eyes darting into the shadows, a prayer on their lips that they would make it back to the false safety of their locked homes. The whispers started again, but they were different now. They were no longer about missing animals or strange lights. They were about the shapes. People began to see things, or thought they saw things, at the edges of their vision. A farmer working his field would catch a flicker of movement in the tree line, and when he looked up, there would be nothing there but the deep, still shadows. A woman drawing water from her well would feel a sudden, prickling sensation on the back of her neck, the undeniable feeling of being watched. The descriptions were always the same. The figures were tall, impossibly thin, and they moved with a silent, unnatural grace. They did not walk. They seemed to flow through the dense undergrowth, their forms indistinct, like columns of smoke or shadow. They were always seen at a distance, just at the edge of the woods, standing perfectly still, watching. No one ever saw a face. No one ever heard a sound. The sightings were so fleeting, so dreamlike, that people began to doubt their own sanity. But the stories persisted, passed in hushed tones from one terrified neighbor to another, until the entire town was convinced that they were surrounded. The woods that had provided them with food and fuel, the woods that had been the backdrop to their entire lives, were now enemy territory. The familiar landscape had become alien and menacing. The Mothers of Providence instituted a new and terrible rule. The children were forbidden from looking toward the hills. It became a litany, a constant, fearful refrain. A mother would see her son's gaze drift toward the dark silhouette of Harrow's Peak, and she would grab him by the shoulder, her fingers digging in, her voice a harsh, frightened whisper. She would tell him to never look there. She would tell him that there were things in the hills that liked to be watched, and that watching them was an invitation. The children, their own minds already fertile ground for fear, learned this lesson quickly. They learned to keep their eyes on the ground, to focus only on the small, safe world of their own yards. The joy of childhood, the boundless curiosity that drove them to explore the creeks and hollows, was extinguished. Their games grew quiet and subdued, and they never strayed far from the sight of their own front doors. The laughter of children, which had once been the most common and hopeful sound in Providence, was replaced by a watchful, anxious silence. The town was losing its future, its innocence sacrificed to the nameless terror that lived on the ridge. The very air seemed to grow heavy with the weight of unspoken dread. Providence was a town holding its breath, waiting for the next terrible thing to happen. It happened 3 weeks after Caleb vanished. Silas Blackwood was a trapper, a man in his late 50s who had spent more of his life in the woods than any other man in the valley. He was a loner by nature, a man who was more comfortable with the company of trees and animals than with people. He was respected for his skill, for his encyclopedic knowledge of the forest's hidden ways. He was the one man in Providence who was not afraid of the wilderness. One morning, he took his rifle and his skinning knife and went to check his trap lines, which ran along a creek at the base of the mountains. He told the blacksmith, the only man he spoke to with any regularity, that he would be back by nightfall. He never returned. The next day, the sheriff organized another search party. They were reluctant to go. The woods no longer felt like their own, but the code of the mountains demanded that they search for their own. They found the scene of his disappearance less than a mile from the town. Silas Blackwood's last trap was there, sprung and empty. Lying beside it on the damp leaves was his rifle, fully loaded, its safety still on. It had not been fired. A few feet away, there was a large, moss-covered tree stump. Plunged deep into the center of the stump, as if by a hand of incredible strength, was Silas's famous skinning knife. The blade was polished to a mirror shine, and it reflected the grim, frightened faces of the men who stared at it. Of Silas Blackwood, the man who knew the woods better than he knew himself, there was no sign. He had been taken, just like Caleb, and he had been taken without a fight, without even raising his weapon. The most capable man in the forest had vanished as completely as a wisp of smoke. The fear in Providence hardened. It turned from a passive, shivering dread into something colder and sharper. It became an obsession. This transformation was most apparent in one man. Dr. Harold Smith was the town physician, a man of science and education from a city in the east. He had come to the Ozarks seeking a simpler life, but he had found something ancient and irrational instead. He was a man who believed in causes and effects, in diagnoses and cures. He saw the fear that was consuming Providence as a disease, a plague of the mind, and he was determined to find its source. He did not believe in phantoms or shapes in the woods. He believed in a human evil, and he believed that all human actions, no matter how depraved, left a trail. While Father Finch was leading prayers and Sheriff Croft was organizing futile patrols, Dr. Smith began his own quiet investigation. He reasoned that if the Harrows were the source of this evil, then they must have a history. No family simply appears out of thin air. They must have come from somewhere. Their roots must be anchored in the past. He decided that the key to understanding the present terror lay buried in the forgotten records of the past. His obsession grew. He spent his days tending to the town's minor ailments, but his nights were spent alone in his small office, surrounded by flickering lamplight and the scent of old paper. He would visit the county courthouse, a day's ride away, and spend hours poring over dusty, leather-bound ledgers. He was searching for a name. He was searching for the first mention of Harrow in these mountains. He was convinced that he could dissect this mystery, cut it open with the scalpel of logic and research, and expose the truth that lay within. He did not know it yet, but the truth he was about to unearth would be far more terrifying than any phantom in the woods. It would be a story written in sickness and death, a legacy of wrongness that had festered in these hills for generations. The doctor's search for a rational explanation was about to lead him into the very heart of an ancient and enduring nightmare. Dr. Harold Smith's investigation began in the musty, silent archives of the Ozark County Courthouse. It was a place where time seemed to have stopped, the air thick with the dry, papery smell of decaying history. Sunlight struggled through tall, grimy windows, illuminating swirling motes of dust that danced in the still air. The county clerk, an old man with a face like a wrinkled apple, regarded the doctor with a weary sort of pity. He had seen men like this before, men who thought they could unravel the tangled knots of the past with logic. The doctor asked for everything: birth registers, death certificates, land deeds, census records. He was looking for a single name: Harrow. He started with the most recent records and began to work his way backward, his sharp, methodical mind searching for a pattern, a beginning. For days, he found nothing. The name Harrow did not appear in any official document from the last 50 years. It was as if the family on the ridge did not legally exist. They had paid no taxes, registered no births, recorded no deaths. They were a blank space in the meticulous, ordered world of civic records. The doctor felt a growing frustration, but his resolve did not waver. The absence of evidence was, in itself, a kind of evidence. It spoke of a deliberate, almost fanatical effort to remain invisible, to live outside the normal bounds of society. He decided to change his approach. Instead of searching for the name Harrow, he began to search for the land itself. Harrow's Peak. He spent 2 full days poring over old, hand-drawn survey maps, his finger tracing the faint, spidery lines that marked the creeks and ridges. He finally found it, on a map dated 1831. The peak was marked, not with a name, but with a small, cryptic symbol, a simple circle with a vertical line drawn through it, and beside it, in the spidery, faded script of the original surveyor, were 2 words: Harrow's Claim. It was the first tangible link, the first proof that the family's connection to that piece of land was not a recent one. It was a deep root, stretching back more than half a century. With this new lead, the doctor returned to the death registers, his search now focused on the years surrounding 1830. And there he found it. A single entry, dated 1833. The name was Jedediah Harrow. The cause of death was listed as unexplained wasting sickness. The doctor's pulse quickened. He read the entry again and again. The details were sparse. Jedediah Harrow, age 42, resident of the Northern Ridges. No family members listed. No physician's signature. Just a simple, stark entry, a life that ended in a question mark. It was the first official record of a Harrow in these mountains, and it was a record of a strange and mysterious death. The doctor's obsession deepened. He spent the next week in the archives, his eyes burning from the strain of reading the cramped, archaic script by the weak light of an oil lamp. He began to find more. They were not always under the name Harrow. He discovered that the property on the peak had changed hands several times over the decades, always sold to a family with a different name. A family named Blackwood in 1840, a family named Thorne in 1860, a family named Kane in 1870. On the surface, these were simple land transactions, but the doctor noticed a disturbing pattern. In each case, the family who bought the land consisted of a man, a woman, and 2 children. And in each case, within a few years of the purchase, the town records would show a series of unexplained deaths associated with that family. In 1845, the death certificate of a Martha Blackwood, age 38, listed the cause as a fever of unknown origin. Her husband and 2 children simply vanished from the census records the following year. In 1862, the Thorne family was recorded in the parish journal of a traveling preacher, who noted their disturbing pallor and their refusal to speak of their past. The next entry, a year later, simply stated that the Thorne cabin was found empty. The pattern was the same, repeated over and over, a grim, cyclical story of appearance, sickness, and disappearance. The names changed, but the location and the outcome were always the same. The doctor's mind, trained in the precise and logical world of medicine, struggled to make sense of what he was finding. He began to suspect that the Harrows had not simply lived on that ridge for generations. He began to suspect that they had lived there under a series of false names, a lineage of phantoms shedding their identities like snakes shedding their skin. The idea was outlandish, a fever dream born of dust and old ink, but the evidence, circumstantial as it was, pointed to a single, terrifying conclusion. This was not a family. It was something else. Something that endured. One evening, deep in the archives, the doctor found something that was not an official record. Tucked into the back of a heavy land deed ledger was a small, leather-bound journal. It had no name on the cover. The pages were filled with the tight, spidery handwriting of a man who was clearly struggling to maintain his composure. The journal belonged to a deputy sheriff from the 1860s, a man named Isaac Page. He had been tasked with investigating the disappearance of the Thorne family. His entries began with a tone of professional detachment, but as the pages turned, a growing sense of dread and madness crept into his words. He wrote of the Thorne cabin, describing the same impossible cleanliness, the same sense of a place abruptly abandoned. He wrote of the local townspeople's whispers, stories of strange lights on the ridge, of livestock vanishing without a trace. It was the same story, the exact same story, that was unfolding in Providence in his own time. The doctor felt a cold chill snake down his spine. He was not uncovering a new horror. He was rediscovering an old one. Isaac Page's journal became more erratic, his handwriting more slanted and desperate. He wrote of seeing figures in the woods, tall and thin, with faces like pale masks. He wrote of a terrible sense of being watched, a feeling that followed him even when he was miles away from the ridge. But it was the final entries that truly horrified the doctor. The deputy wrote about the Thorne children. He had spoken to a neighbor who had seen them playing. The neighbor had sworn that the children never seemed to grow. He said he had known the family for 5 years, and the boy and girl were the exact same size as the day they had arrived. He described them as having old, watchful eyes, the eyes of people who had seen too much. The deputy had dismissed it as the fantasy of a superstitious old man. But then he found a daguerreotype, an early form of photograph that had been left behind in the abandoned cabin. It showed the Thorne family, standing stiffly in front of their home. The deputy wrote that the children in the photograph, a boy and a girl of about 10 and 12, looked identical to 2 other children he had seen in a much older family portrait from 20 years prior. A portrait of the Blackwood family. The names were different, the clothes were different, but the faces, he swore, were the same. Cousins, perhaps, he had tried to reason. But the resemblance was too perfect. They were not cousins. They were the same children, untouched by the passage of 2 decades. Isaac Page's final entry was a single, panicked sentence, scrawled across the page. He wrote that the family was not gone. He wrote that they were still here. After that, the journal ended. The doctor checked the county records. Deputy Isaac Page had disappeared in the winter of 1863. His horse was found wandering 10 miles from his home. Of the man himself, no trace was ever found. Dr. Smith closed the journal, his hands trembling. The room, which had once felt like a sanctuary of knowledge, now felt like a tomb. The air was heavy with the weight of all the forgotten deaths, the unanswered questions. He finally understood. The Harrows were not just a reclusive family. They were a blight, a recurring sickness that had afflicted these hills for generations. They were a cycle of terror that renewed itself with each passing decade, leaving a trail of death and madness in its wake. He had found references in other private letters and journals he managed to unearth. A preacher in the 1830s wrote of strange gatherings by torchlight on the high ridges, of chants that sounded like a mockery of church hymns. A midwife's diary from the 1840s described a strange birthmark, the same circle with a vertical line through it that the doctor had seen on the old map, appearing on a stillborn child in the valley. The mark was said to be a sign of the family on the peak having claimed the child's soul. These were not the writings of educated men, but they painted a consistent and terrifying picture. They spoke of a presence in the mountains that was ancient, patient, and deeply malevolent. They spoke of a family that did not age, that did not die, that simply endured. The doctor's scientific mind reeled. The concepts he was grappling with had no place in his world of anatomy and chemistry. But the evidence was undeniable. A chorus of ghostly voices, all telling the same impossible story. The doctor gathered his notes, his hands stuffing the papers into his bag with a frantic energy. He had to return to Providence. He had to warn them. He had believed that the truth would be a weapon, that by understanding the enemy, they could defeat it. But the truth he had found was not a weapon. It was a death sentence. It told him that this was not a fight they could win. They were not facing a family of murderers. They were facing something that defied every law of nature he had ever known. As he rode his horse back through the darkening woods, the familiar landscape seemed twisted and monstrous. Every shadow seemed to hold a tall, thin figure. Every gust of wind seemed to carry a whispered name. He was no longer an objective observer, an archivist of the past. He was now a part of the story, another character in the Harrow's long and bloody history. He knew that what he had learned made him a target. He had looked into their past, and he was certain that they were now looking at him. When he finally saw the flickering lights of Providence in the valley below, it was not a sight of comfort. It was a sight of a town under siege, a small, fragile island of humanity surrounded by an ancient and hungry darkness. The new evidence he carried was not a key to their salvation. It was a confirmation of their doom. It forced a terrible new question. If the Harrows were not who they seemed to be, then what was inside their abandoned house? What secrets were locked inside those impossible iron chests? The fear and obsession that had driven the doctor to the archives now pushed the entire town toward a new and reckless course of action. They had to go back. They had to return to the cabin on Harrow's Peak. They had to unlock its secrets, no matter the cost. The return to Harrow's Peak was a desperate act, a pilgrimage born of pure terror. Dr. Harold Smith's revelations had shattered the last vestiges of hope in Providence. The knowledge that the evil in the hills was not new, but ancient and recurring, had broken something in the town's collective spirit. They were not just fighting a sinister family. They were fighting their own history, a curse that had been woven into the very fabric of the mountains. The men who gathered in the pre-dawn gloom were not the same men who had made the first trip up the ridge. The anger was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed, grim resignation. They were no longer seeking justice. They were seeking an ending. They carried with them not only rifles, but also heavy axes and iron pry bars. This time, they would not be denied. This time, the secrets of the Harrow cabin would be brought into the light, even if that light burned them all to ash. Sheriff Elias Croft led them again, but his authority felt like a costume, a role he was playing from memory. The true leader of this grim expedition was Dr. Smith, the man of science. His face pale and gaunt from sleepless nights among the dead, had become their reluctant prophet of doom. He walked beside the sheriff, his medical bag now filled with his research, the weight of the past heavy on his shoulder. The woods felt different this time. The silence was heavier, the shadows deeper. It was no longer a simple absence of sound. It was a presence, a watchful, intelligent silence that seemed to press in on them from all sides. The men did not speak. They walked with their heads down, their eyes scanning the path ahead, each man locked in his own private hell of fear and anticipation. They were trespassing, and they knew it. They were walking into a place that was not meant for them, a place where the rules of their world did not apply. The strange, barren clearing at the top of the peak was just as they had left it. The cabin stood like a tombstone in the center of the dead earth, a monument to a century of sorrow. The air was still and cold, and the foul, sweet smell of decay still hung faintly in the air, a ghost of the horror they had found within. There was no hesitation this time. The sheriff walked directly to the door and kicked it open. The hinges screamed in protest, the sound unnaturally loud in the profound stillness. The single, dark room was exactly as they had left it. The rotting stew still sat on the meticulously set table. The perfectly made bed still stood in the corner. The two impossible chests still sat against the far wall, their black iron bands like ribs on a carcass. They were silent, patient, and full of secrets. The men moved with a frantic, desperate energy. Two of them took their axes to the table, smashing the wooden plates and tin cups, their grunts of effort a small act of rebellion against the cabin's oppressive order. The black iron pot was overturned, its putrid contents spilling across the clean floorboards, a vile stain on the cabin's impossible perfection. The smell was overwhelming, a physical assault that made several of the men gag and retch. While this small act of cathartic destruction was happening, the doctor and the sheriff turned their attention to the floor. The doctor, in his obsessive research, had read a detail in an old journal that had stuck in his mind. A man who had survived a brief encounter with a member of the Kane family, one of the Harrow's previous incarnations, had described their home as having a hollow sound underfoot. The doctor knelt down, his hand pressing against the smooth, dark wood of the floor. He knocked. The sound was a dull thud. He moved a few feet and knocked again. Thud. He continued this methodical process, moving across the room like a physician searching for a tumor. Then, near the wall with the empty wardrobe, he heard it. A subtle but unmistakable difference. A deep, resonant boom. A hollow space beneath. The men brought the pry bars. The wood of the floor was unnaturally hard, resisting their efforts. Splinters flew, and the iron bars bent under the strain. But finally, with a loud crack that echoed like a gunshot, a section of the floor gave way. The space beneath the floor was not a root cellar. It was a pit. It was about 4 feet deep and 10 feet square, and it was filled to the brim with bones. They were not the bones of animals. They were human bones, skulls, ribs, femurs, the delicate bird-like bones of hands and feet. They were jumbled together in a chaotic, tangled mass, a testament to years, decades, of unimaginable violence. The bones were of all sizes. The skulls of adults lay beside the impossibly small, fragile skulls of infants. It was a mass grave, hidden beneath the floor of this quiet, orderly room. The men who had been so full of frantic energy moments before were now frozen, their faces masks of silent, screaming horror. They stared into the pit, and the pit seemed to stare back, 100 empty eye sockets judging them from the darkness. The history of Providence's lost and forgotten was here, in this terrible pit. The farmers who had vanished from their fields, the children who had wandered into the woods and never returned, the travelers who had been last seen on the mountain pass. Their final resting place was this hole, their bodies disassembled and discarded like trash. This was the source of the Harrow's sustenance. This was how they lived, utterly and completely apart from the world of men. They did not need to buy flour or salt. They fed on the people of the valley. While the men were still reeling from the discovery of the bone pit, Dr. Smith, his face as pale as the skulls at his feet, turned his attention to the chests. The foul smell was stronger now, seeping from the seams of the dark wood. He knew, with a sick certainty, that the true horror was yet to come. The locks, which had resisted their earlier attempts, now seemed to be the final guardians of a terrible truth. The blacksmith, a man of immense physical strength, took a sledgehammer to the first chest. The sound of the iron hammer hitting the iron bands was deafening, a brutal, rhythmic clang that filled the small cabin. The iron did not break. It dented, but it held. It was as if the chests were forged from a material not of this world. But the force of the blows caused something else to give way. The wood around the lock, as hard as it was, finally began to splinter and crack. With one final, desperate blow, the lock mechanism shattered, and the heavy lid of the chest sprang open. The contents were not gold or treasure. The chest was filled with dozens of glass jars, of all shapes and sizes, and inside each jar, suspended in a pale, yellowish fluid, was a preserved human organ. A heart, a liver, a pair of lungs, a coiled length of intestine. Each jar was meticulously labeled with a small parchment tag, the names written in a neat, elegant script. They were the names of the people of Providence, not just the dead, but the living. The men stared in disbelief, their minds refusing to process what their eyes were seeing. One farmer, Jedediah Croft, the man whose sow had been the first thing to vanish, saw his own name on a jar containing a healthy, perfectly preserved liver. He let out a choked, strangled cry and stumbled back, his face a mask of utter disbelief. The sheriff, his face a grim, gray mask, moved to the second chest. The blacksmith, his movements now robotic, his eyes wide and vacant, shattered the lock on the second chest with 3 powerful blows. The lid creaked open. This chest was not filled with jars. It was filled with books, dozens of them, all bound in the same dark, leathery material. But as the sheriff reached in and lifted one out, he realized it was not leather. The cover was soft, pliable, and patterned with the faint, unmistakable pores of human skin. He opened the book. The pages were not paper. They were thin, stretched vellum, and they were covered in writing. But the writing was not just in ink. It was a mixture of ink and something darker, a brownish-red pigment that could only be dried blood. The books were ledgers, and in them the Harrows had kept their records. There were crude anatomical diagrams of human figures, lines and symbols drawn over them, indicating points of incision, places to harvest. There were hymns, the familiar words of the church, but they had been rewritten. The verses of praise to God had been twisted into a strange, guttural language. The new words inserted between the old, a blasphemous mockery of their faith. But it was the last ledger, the one at the very bottom of the chest, that broke Sheriff Elias Croft. It was a family ledger. Page after page listed the names of the families of Providence, going back generations. Beside each name were notes, observations. He saw his grandfather's name with a note that said strong constitution, good for labor. He saw his mother's name with a note that said prone to melancholia, spirit is weak. And then he saw his own name, Elias Croft, and beside it, in the same neat, elegant script, was a single, chilling entry. Wife is fertile, daughter is healthy, prime stock. He dropped the book as if it were on fire. The Harrows had not just been killing them, they had been studying them. They had been breeding them. The people of Providence were not their neighbors. They were their livestock. The revelation shattered the last of the men's composure. The claustrophobic cabin, filled with the smell of death and the evidence of a monstrous, generational evil, became a pressure cooker of insanity. Men began to weep openly, their bodies racked with sobs of grief and terror. One man began to laugh, a high, unhinged sound that was more terrifying than any scream. He had seen his own children's names in the ledger, with notes about their potential. The sheriff, the pillar of law and order, stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the open book on the floor. His world, his family, his entire identity, reduced to a line of text in a farmer's ledger. The doctor, the man of reason, was on his knees by the bone pit, his scientific mind completely overwhelmed by the sheer, industrial scale of the butchery. He had wanted to understand the evil. He had wanted to classify it, to give it a name. But this was beyond any category of human depravity he had ever conceived. This was a different kind of evil, an agricultural evil, cold, patient, and utterly without passion. The men stumbled out of the cabin, one by one, gasping for the clean mountain air, their minds permanently scarred by what they had seen. They had found the Harrow's secrets. They had learned the truth. The truth was that their lives had never been their own. They were a crop, tended and harvested by a family of monsters who lived on the hill. The fear was now absolute. There was nothing left to do but wait for the harvest. As the sun began to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the valley, the men of Providence returned to their homes for a final night of watchfulness. They barred their doors and loaded their rifles, but they knew it was a futile gesture. They were not waiting for a fight. They were waiting for the farmers to return to their field. But it was already too late. The harvest had already begun. The final night in Providence was a descent into a collective, silent madness. The men who returned from Harrow's Peak were broken things, their spirits hollowed out by the horrors they had witnessed in the cabin. They did not speak of what they had found. They did not need to. The truth was a contagion, and it spread through the town not by words, but by the dead, vacant look in their eyes. The discovery of the bone pit, the jars of organs, the ledgers bound in human skin, had been a blow from which their reality could not recover. The very foundations of their world had been revealed to be a lie. They were not pioneers, carving a life from the wilderness under the watchful eye of a benevolent God. They were cattle in a pen, their lives and the lives of their ancestors nothing more than a long, patient agricultural experiment conducted by the creatures on the ridge. The town locked itself down for the last time. Every door was barred, every window shuttered. But these were not the actions of defiance. They were the last, futile rituals of the condemned. There was no hope of survival, no strategy for defense. They were simply waiting for the end. Winter came to the mountains that night, a sudden and premature arrival. The temperature plummeted, and a thin, spectral snow began to fall, the flakes drifting down out of a starless, ink-black sky. The wind died, and a profound, unnatural silence fell over the valley. It was a silence that was heavier and more absolute than any they had ever known. It was the silence of a held breath, of a world waiting for a final, terrible act to unfold. Inside the cabins, families huddled together for warmth, but the chill they felt was not from the cold. It was a cold that radiated from the very marrow of their bones, a soul-deep frost of utter despair. The children, sensing the terror in their parents, were silent, their wide eyes reflecting the flickering firelight. The adults sat with their rifles and their axes, their faces illuminated in the stark, dancing light, looking like figures in a grim, final tableau. They were no longer waiting for a physical assault. They understood now that the Harrows did not need to break down their doors. The true horror was that the Harrows had been inside their lives all along, in their blood, in their history, in the names written in those terrible books. It was the 10-year-old Elias Vance who saw them first. His father, lost in a catatonic state of shock since returning from the peak, had forgotten to secure the shutter on one small window. Elias, driven by a morbid, childlike curiosity that had not yet been completely extinguished by fear, crept to the window and peered out into the snowy darkness. And he saw them. They were standing at the edge of the woods, just where the fields of his family's farm began. The four of them, Silas Harrow, his wife Elspeth, and their two children, the boy and the girl. They were standing in a perfect line, their forms dark and sharp against the pale, snow-dusted ground. They were utterly still, like statues carved from the night itself. The moonlight, breaking through a brief gap in the clouds, illuminated them, and Elias felt a fresh wave of terror wash over him, a terror that was colder and sharper than anything he had yet felt. They looked exactly as the oldest whispers in the town had described them. But more than that, they looked exactly as they had been described in the records from 50 years prior. The children were not children. They were the same age as the boy and girl in the daguerreotype of the Thorne family from 1860. Silas and Elspeth were the same age as the couple who had been known as the Canes in 1870. They had not aged a single day. Time had not touched them. They were a fixed, eternal point of malevolence in a world of decay and death. Elias did not scream. The sight was too terrible, too fundamentally wrong for such a simple human reaction. He stumbled back from the window, his breath catching in his throat, and pulled at his father's sleeve. He said that they were here. He said that the family from the hill was in their field. The boy's words broke the spell of paralysis that had gripped the cabin. His father, his eyes slowly focusing, rose and went to the window. He saw them. He let out a low, guttural sound, a noise of pure animal terror. The warning spread from cabin to cabin. A silent alarm passed through the shared dread of the community. At windows and through cracks in the doors, the people of Providence peered out, and they all saw the same impossible sight. The Harrow family, standing silently at the edge of the ridge, or at the end of a field, or by the town's single well. They were simply there, their presence a quiet, damning judgment. One of the most terrifying details, which was shared in hushed tones for years afterward by the few who survived, was the reaction of the town's animals. The dogs, who would normally bark themselves into a frenzy at the slightest disturbance, were silent. They whimpered in their kennels, their tails tucked between their legs, refusing to even look in the direction of the strange figures. The horses in the barns were restless, their panicked movements and frightened noises a stark contrast to the silence of the dogs. It was as if the dogs, creatures of instinct, understood that what stood in the fields was not something to be challenged, but something to be feared on a primal, cellular level. In a few of the cabins, a desperate, final act of defiance took place. Men, driven by a surge of pure, hopeless rage, unbarred their doors and raised their rifles. They took aim at the silent figures standing in the snow. They fired. The crack of the rifles shattered the night's silence, the sound echoing off the cold, silent mountains. But the figures did not fall. They did not flinch. They did not react in any way at all. It was as if the bullets had passed through them like smoke. For a moment, they remained, silent and still, their unseen eyes fixed on the town. Then, as one, they turned, and they did not run. They simply vanished. They did not fade or dissolve. One moment they were there, dark shapes against the snow, and the next, the space they had occupied was empty. They had stepped back into the tree line, back into the darkness that had spawned them. And then, the screaming began. It was not the screaming of an attack. It was the screaming of minds breaking, of a reality that had finally, irrevocably, collapsed. The people of Providence, who had held their terror in a fragile, silent vessel, finally let it shatter. The sound was a chorus of pure, undiluted madness, a symphony of souls being torn apart. What happened in the years that followed is a story of ghosts and whispers. The town of Providence did not survive. Some of its people fled in the dead of that winter night, taking nothing with them but the clothes on their backs and the madness in their eyes. They scattered to the winds, carrying their terrible story with them, a story that was so unbelievable that they were often dismissed as madmen, their trauma misdiagnosed as the ravings of the insane. Others remained, unable or unwilling to leave the only homes they had ever known. But the town slowly died. The fields were left fallow. The cabins fell into disrepair. The silence that had fallen on that terrible night never truly lifted. The survivors were a community of ghosts, haunted by what they had seen and what they had learned from the ledgers in the dark cabin. They lived with the knowledge that they were nothing more than a failed crop, and that the farmers were still out there, somewhere. The Harrow cabin on the peak remained, untouched by time, a dark and silent monument to the evil that had consumed the valley. Years later, travelers passing through the area would report seeing strange lights on the ridge, and some claimed to have seen a tall, thin man standing at the edge of the woods, watching them pass. The story of the Harrows did not end in the Ozarks. It simply moved on. Decades later, in a newly settled valley in the mountains of Colorado, a small, isolated town began to experience strange disturbances. Livestock began to vanish from locked barns, leaving no tracks. The children began to whisper of strange cold fires seen on a high, lonely ridge that overlooked the town. And a new family, a quiet and reclusive family who never came to church or market, had just moved into an old, abandoned cabin on that ridge. They were a man, a woman, and 2 children. They went by the name of Pearson. In another town, years after that, in the deep woods of the Appalachian Mountains, an identical story began to unfold. A reclusive family, this time called Miller, had taken up residence in a place the locals had always considered haunted. And the same pattern of quiet, creeping terror began. The stories were always the same. The family was always a man, a woman, and 2 children. And they were always unchanged, untouched by the passage of time. The Harrows were not a family. They were a seed, and they would simply blow on the wind until they found new soil in which to plant their ancient and terrible roots. The file on what happened in Providence remains open, its final page unwritten. The true nature of the Harrow family, their origin, their purpose, remains forever unanswered, a dark and enduring question mark in the forgotten corners of American history. The case file on the Harrow family is now closed. Thank you for walking these halls of history with us. If you are new here, subscribe to stand among those who will be present when the next case is opened, and leave a comment to share your thoughts on what you have witnessed.